So far, the outcome of most World Trade Organization or WTO meetings has been nothing but disagreement. Members of the Intergovernmental Organization, which regulates and facilitates international trade, had agreed only once on a global deal in its 27-year history. That happened in 2013. The second ever such multilateral agreement, which was related to fishery subsidies and that created new global trading rules, came nearly 9 years later last Friday at the 12th Ministerial Conference, dubbed the MC12 in Geneva. WTO Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala called it unprecedented. Initially scheduled to end on 15th June, the ministerial gathering was extended by 2 days to allow more time for reaching agreements. On 17th June, after more than 5 days of grueling negotiations, WTO members hammered out a string of decisions on fishing subsidies, COVID-19 vaccine production, food security, and e-commerce, among others. The WTO works on the principle of consensus, which means even a single member can block an agreement for any reason. The accord to curb subsidies and overcapacity in the fishing industry wrapped up 21 years of negotiations on the matter, and it was the first time that an agreement was concluded on sustainability grounds. Governments dole out $35 billion in fishing subsidies annually, of which $20 billion directly contributes to overfishing. The WTO agreement bans any subsidy for vessels or operators engaged in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, with a 2-year exemption for developing countries, including India, within their exclusive economic zones or 200 nautical miles. Similarly, it also prohibits subsidies for fishing in overfished stocks, with a 2-year relief for poorer nations. India's demand to extend the 12 nautical mile limit to 200 has been agreed, but its demand for a 25-year transition period for developing countries was not granted. India argued that it gives barely $15 in subsidy every year to a fisher family, while some developed countries give as much as $75,000. Nearly 9 million fisher families in India receive support from the government. India and some other developing countries, however, won concessions that removed an entire chapter from a proposal that could have threatened some types of subsidies favoring small-scale, artisanal fishing. The Fisheries subsidy agreement expires in 4 years unless WTO members broaden it to include new rules to fight overfishing and overcapacity.
So you can really sort of understand that there is a huge slip between the cup and the lip. So we went with a very ambitious sort of demand, and we have now settled for it. And these after 2 years, we don't know what's going to happen. And this whole agreement is coming up for review in 4 years. So again, it's a big uncertainty that we are looking at.
Since the other countries which were the major proponents of the fisheries subsidies proposals and disciplines on fisheries subsidies have secured more or less what they wanted to achieve, India would have to do play a defensive role in securing what it wanted as a carve-out of 25 years or adequate policy space for a certain number of years so that it could build up fishing infrastructure. And this assumes extra significance because of the Pradhan Mantri Matsya Sampada Yojana, which was announced some time ago with an outlay of 20,000 crores to build up our fishing infrastructure for marine fishing.
After over 20 months of discussions, a partial patent waiver for COVID-19 vaccines found its place in the so-called Geneva package. India, South Africa, and 60 other countries had sought a waiver of intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics. But the deal only allows developing countries to issue licenses to domestic companies for the manufacture and export of COVID-19 vaccines for 5 years without the consent of the patent holders, although they must be compensated. Coming too late into the pandemic, the deal may not have a meaningful impact on production amid an oversupply of vaccines. WTO members will, however, consider extending the waiver to therapeutics and diagnostics after 6 months. India's demand to allow it to export food grain from its public stockholding could also not be agreed upon. Existing rules don't allow WTO members to export subsidized grains, as it may distort global food prices. WTO members, meanwhile, agreed against imposing export restrictions on foodstuffs purchased for humanitarian purposes by the UN World Food Programme. India has also been constantly demanding a permanent solution on public stockholding for food security. This was, in fact, India's topmost priority for the Geneva WTO meeting, according to Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal. But the issue has been pushed to the next ministerial. Agricultural subsidies for developing countries such as India are capped at 10% of the value of production based on the 1986-88 reference price.
We have been actually arguing that it is the sovereign right of any country to provide food to its poor. And therefore, we wanted a solution. So if what they were pointing out, the developed countries and others like Brazil, that our public distribution system is not consistent with the WTO rules, we were seeking a solution, a permanent solution out of this logjam. We haven't got that. The other problem was that India is now an agricultural exporter, and as India has exported increasingly, we have run into these big grain companies, the big interests in the developed countries, who are now questioning India, asking questions as to whether India is using the subsidized food that we are storing in our in the food security stocks, whether these stocks are being released in the international market, and they are trying to pressurize us on this issue. And again, there's not been any way out of this, so we will be under pressure.
WTO members also agreed to maintain the current practice of not imposing customs duties on electronic transmissions until the next ministerial conference. Such e-transmissions are worth hundreds of billions of dollars a year. The moratorium was adopted in 1998 and has been periodically extended. An end to the moratorium, which India has been demanding, would pave way for tariffs on movies and music streaming, emails and video calls, game downloads, software updates, financial transactions, and corporate data flows. India, along with countries like South Africa and Indonesia, insists that the moratorium is depriving them of customs revenue from digital products, especially new technologies like 3D printing, big data analytics, and artificial intelligence. India says a reconsideration of the moratorium is important for developing countries to preserve policy space for their digital advancement, regulate imports, and generate customs revenue. A decision on India's key concerns has been deferred to a future date. Also, India has not ceded ground either. Since the developed countries appear to have achieved what they wanted on the topics that came up at the WTO, it is important to ask whether India will find itself on a sticky wicket when future negotiations on these matters are opened up again.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.
सब अच्छी दिख रही हैं यार, कौन सी खरीदूं?
ये तो वही बात हुई, 4000 शेयर्स लिस्टेड है, कौन सा लूं?
वो तो सबसे आसान है।
तुझे 5 पैसा नहीं पता?
अब तो सबको पता है। 5 पैसा पर है 4000 स्टॉक्स की रिसर्च, टेक्निकल टूल्स और इन्वेस्टमेंट आइडियाज। डाउनलोड 5 पैसा नाउ।
अब तो सबको पता है, investing made easy and rewarding with 5 paisa. Investments in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing.